Now we have a very special guest tonight, Lauren James. I know Lauren from years and years ago when she was a pupil at my preschool. Lauren has an identical twin sister, Jackie, and I remember very clearly that we couldn't tell the difference between Lauren and Jackie because they were absolutely identical. I'm sure they may have changed a bit now, but it was very hard to tell the difference. And a bit about Lauren. Lauren completed her Bachelor of Science degree in botany and entomology at Rhodes University here in Grahamstown, in the town where I live now. She then went on to complete her honours degree in botany at Rhodes as well. Her research focused on pollination biology, leading to her studying bird pollination and how different plant species are adapted to be pollinated by different types of birds. And then after her honours degree, Lauren was chosen for an internship at the Compton Herbarium at the world famous Kirstenbosch National Botanical Gardens in Cape Town. If you haven't been to Kirstenbosch before and you live in South Africa, you really need to make an effort to get there. It is the most beautiful place in the world. While Lauren was there, her interest in taxonomy and systematics led her to pursue her master's degree at the University of Cape Town in systematics and evolutionary ecology of daisies of the genus Osteospermum. Lauren has a very keen interest in all aspects of the natural world, including birds. Tonight, Lauren will be talking about the roles birds play in the pollination of plants and how birds have shaped the patterns in the flowering times of plants. We so look forward to your talk, Lauren. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Danette, and thank you very much to everyone who's come this evening or afternoon or morning, wherever you are in the world, to listen to this talk. And I especially want to thank my friends and family who've made special efforts to be here as well. So I'll just share my screen. Okay, so I trust everyone can see my screen.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so as Lynette said, I'm going to be presenting work about bird pollination that I did as part of my honours research when I was at Rhodes University. And this was work I did in 2020, so it's a little bit of time ago now. It was during the COVID lockdown. So most of it was based on data that I could get from various sources, but I'll explain that later. So what I was looking at is how birds impact the time that plants flower. And this, of course, because I'm based in South Africa, was focused on South African plants. So for a start, pollination. This is a very necessary process for the reproduction of most angiosperms, which are flowering plants. And it often requires a vector to move the pollen grains from the anthers, which is the male reproductive organ of a flower where the pollen is produced. So to move the pollen from the anthers to the stigma, which is the female part of the flower. And so there are many different processes that can be used to facilitate this. So I'm sure you all heard of wind pollination, so you think of things like grasses. And then we're all very familiar with insect pollination systems. So bees, butterflies, those kinds of things we're all very familiar with as pollinators. Now, within different groups of, well, plants that are pollinated by a particular organism or abiotic factors such as wind or water, there are these patterns that can frequently be noticed where the floral traits of a particular group of plants that share a pollinator are often very similar. So they may share the same scent or flower shape, the orientation or positioning of the flowers, the amount of nectar and pollen, as well as the quality and quantity and other properties of nectar and pollen, whether or not there are nectar guides on the petals. So these are little lines on the petals that can indicate to pollinators where they need to probe to reach nectar, and the color of the plants. So, for example, if we think of butterfly pollinated plants, the butterfly pollination syndrome, which is what you call this group of collective traits, a syndrome, which is this group of traits that have all evolved, adapted to a particular pollinator. So if we think of butterfly pollination, for example, butterflies require somewhere to perch. They need to sit on the flowers, and they need, well, they're attracted by a fairly large amount of nectar and a sweet scent. And they also, plants that are pollinated by butterflies frequently have got quite long tubes, because the butterflies need to stick their proboscis in to reach the nectar, and in doing so, touch the pollen, and that the pollen will be then transferred onto the butterfly, then fly into the next flower, and then it'll do the same. So here's two examples of different structures of flowers which are adapted to different kinds of pollinators. So with butterflies, as I said, lots of small flowers, tubes, lots of nectar, sweet scent. And so this collective group of traits is called sphingophily, which is the butterfly pollination syndrome. Excuse me. Then here's another example, which is the hawk moth pollination syndrome, which is called sphingophily. And hawk moths have a very different way of life to butterflies. Sorry. They hover while feeding, so they don't need somewhere to perch. And so you can see this flower has got very few open flowers compared to the butterfly pollinated one, because they don't need a place to perch. They can just have one flower, again a long tube, because hawk moths have got long proboscis. And you can see very nicely here that this flower is very well adapted to have the pollen transferred onto the underneath side of the head of this hawk moth from this anther over here. So there are these suites of traits that are shared between different groups of plants, so different species, different families, that are adapted to particular pollinators. And so we're very familiar with insect pollination and these groups of traits that are adapted for insects. So now what about birds? The bird pollination syndrome is called ornithophily. And this is a group of traits that I'm sure if we think of a plant that we've seen a bird feeding on, these are the kinds of things that come to mind. So bright colors, red, orange, yellow, long tubular flowers that require the bird to stick its beak in or really get its head into it, and in the process get the pollen onto its head, or a brush-like flower that will also brush the pollen onto the bird's head. Bird-pollinated plants also tend to have a large quantity of nectar to attract birds to the plant. No scent, because scent really isn't important to birds. And importantly, in at least the African species, where we don't have hovering birds like hummingbirds, it's important to have a place to perch so that the birds can have somewhere to hang while they feed on the flowers. So the flowers have to be fairly robust in the South African bird-pollinated plants, at least. Now, there's been evidence that rather than it just being this one syndrome, ornithophily, there's actually a split between two different groups of bird-pollinated plants. So these differ based on what kind of birds are pollinating that particular species. So there are specialist birds, or plants pollinated by specialist birds. So specialist birds would be things like sunbirds, sugarbirds, honey guides. Sorry, not honey guides. I think they've got short beaks. But birds have got long, thin beaks that can fit into much more tubular flowers. So these plants are often the flowers much more closed, so they really have to probe their head in deeply before they can reach the pollen. The nectar, and in the process get the pollen deposited on their face. So they have long tubes and usually a quite high volume of nectar, and it's usually quite rich in sucrose. And that is an important sugar for energy for birds such as sunbirds, which rely quite strongly on nectar as a food source. Then the other group of bird-pollinated plants is pollinated by generalist birds. These are much less specific birds that just opportunistically feed on nectar. So it's such as orioles, weavers, starlings, so really the big opportunistic birds that you sometimes see feeding on nectar from flowers. And to suit their short and much broader bills and their larger bodies, the plants pollinated by them have much more open flowers, so they can reach in and reach the nectar, but in still doing so get the pollen distribute on their heads. And they're much more open and brush-like, like this grey ear. So there's these two separate groups of bird-pollinated plants in South Africa. And these are all based, these traits I've been mentioning are all physical traits of the flowers. But what other traits might there be that have led to this split to be into two classes of bird pollination? So one such factor could be the flowering phenology, which is the timing of the flowering. So in what season do these species flower? And flowering phenology is an important trait in some other pollination systems, such as insect pollination systems. And a very nice example of this is seen in the west coast of South Africa, where there's this group of 20 species of Iridaceae, Orchidaceae, and Geraniaceae that all have this, they all form this very tight pollination syndrome with these flowers with long tubes, pale colors, and then these bright nectar guides showing the entrance to the tube of the flower. And these are all pollinated by long proboscis flies, which have these really long tongues that they stick into the flowers to reach the nectar. And so with these flies, they have a very short active flying period during the year. So they've got a short lifespan in which they emerge, they need to feed, and then after a few months, then they completely disappear again. And this graph here from the study that was done on this pollination system shows the time of flowering of these species in 3 different habitats and the time when these pollinators are active. And so you can see that flowering phenology here is very important. So the timing of flowering has to really line up with these pollinators, otherwise they just won't get pollinated. And such a specialist system that if, I think just 2 species of long-tongued fly, if they don't pollinate these species, then pollination just doesn't happen for these plants. So this is an example where flowering phenology is really important for this particular pollination syndrome to ensure pollination. So is flowering phenology important in bird pollination systems? There have been a few studies looking at, well, mostly the physical traits of flowers and the nectar traits, and these are mostly focused on the just like a small group of species rather than across bird pollinated plants in South Africa. And they've really there hasn't been a large scale study comparing between specialist and generalist bird pollinated plants to see whether flowering phenology is important at all. But from the few studies that there have been internationally, there is theory that suggests that specialist bird pollinated plants will flower throughout the year. And this is because specialist birds feed predominantly on nectar, so it's an important part of their food. And so the flowers of different species are staggered in their flowering throughout the year to reduce competition between them, prevent hybridation, and also to increase pollination efficiency, because then if just a few species are flowering, then the chances of a bird going from that species to another individual of that same species is higher. Whereas if there are lots of different species flowering all at the same time, the pollen may just be lost on a plant of another species. And this kind of distribution and spreading out of plants that are pollinated by the same pollinator is a kind of facilitation which is called pollinator support, when they're kind of collectively working together to support their pollinator throughout the year. In generalist bird pollination, the pollinators are much less reliable than specialist bird pollinators. So these are opportunistic nectar feeders that only will really feed on nectar reliably when other food sources are scarce. And for this reason, it is thought that they will predominantly flower in winter when other food sources are scarce, and that will allow them to make most efficient use of these pollinators. And this type of mass flowering together to attract pollinators to a particular area is a form of facilitation called pollinator sharing. Okay, so my hypothesis for my study was that flowering phenology is a floral trait adapted to specific pollinators, and that specialist bird-pollinated plant species will have year-round temporal partitioning of flowering, and species pollinated by generalist birds will have their flowering simultaneously in winter. So my study region was in the southeast summer rainfall region of South Africa. I included just this region because of the fact that different rainfall times of the year will definitely have an impact on flowering phenology, because plants can't escape the climate in which they occur. So there's these limitations on their growth and reproduction that are based a lot on climate. So I focused just on the southeastern summer rainfall region, as you can see in this green circle. Okay. So my first step was to form a list of bird-pollinated species. And for this, I found species from going through literature to see if there are records of plants pollinated by birds. And I also looked at floral traits using the syndrome concept of large red flowers with no scent and such, as I've said. And from this, I found 143 plant species that were potentially bird pollinated. I then split this into species that were most probably pollinated by specialist birds and those most probably pollinated by generalist birds. And this was based on records in literature, observations of birds visiting flowers, and then when those weren't available, also on the floral traits. And so there were lots of records I got from platforms such as iNaturalist, because going out and seeing all these things yourself is just not possible for such a large number of species. So records from iNaturalist and BirdPix, and then of course the literature was a very important base for that as well. And so from that, I managed to get 69 species identified as specialist bird pollinated, and these are from 17 plant families, and 20 species I identified as generalist bird pollinated from 4 plant families. So that was 62% of the plant species that were identified as potentially bird pollinated. So then I needed to find the flowering times for all these different species. What time do they flower? And for this, I wanted individual flowering records, so individual plants and the time that they were recorded. And so a large amount of my data I got from the botanical database of Southern Africa, from SANBI, and then from iNaturalist. iNaturalist was a really wonderful resource for this. So I went through hundreds of pictures of plants and scored whether or not they were flowering, and I could get my data from that. I then also got a couple of records from Tree Map, which is like an online museum in South Africa that's also used for uploading pictures of trees and plants. There's also a bird one, similar to iNaturalist and a bit of a precursor before it. And then also I got records from the Salmarsh Herbarium in Grahamstown, and then field observations. Okay, so I've identified my species as potentially bird pollinated. I've got all these many records of individual flowering times of different species. So now I'm just going to explain a little bit about my data analysis. So the thing about flowering phenology is it goes through seasons, so it's a cyclical phenomenon, and therefore doesn't have a distinct start and end point, because though we have a calendar year that goes from January to December, December and January are as close as September is to October. And so if you try and analyze data using just a year as your linear line, these are all data points of flowering times of Erythrina humiana, the dwarf coral tree. And you can see if you try and calculate the mean flowering time from these records using linear statistics, it's going to give you the mean flowering time here in April. And you can see from the spread of this data that really, that is not the mean flowering time of the species, because it flowers over summer. And so there's a kind of statistics called circular statistics that takes this into account. And you can see that gives a much more accurate mean flowering time. So it was therefore necessary to use circular statistics for my analyses. And how that works, I'm going to explain this just briefly so you can understand my figures coming up, is that it looks at the distribution of, well, you convert the data to be from dates into degrees of a circle. And then it calculates the angle, which gives you basically it's pretty much the date of the flowering time. And so the mean angle will give you the mean flowering time of that particular plant species. And then it calculates a result. You can also calculate a resultant, which gives you an idea of the concentration or uniformity of your data points. So if all of them are flowering in January and February, your resultant will be very long in this direction, which is given by your angle. Or if they are a bit more distributed, your resultant will be shorter. And so that gives an indication of the peak flowering time and the concentration or uniformity of data around the circle. And that uses two statistical tests, but I don't think we need to go into that. Okay, oh, sorry, to go back. There we go. So these are my results. This is the results from the specialist bird-pollinated species. Each dot here represents the mean flowering time of a particular species, and the number is also shown by these gray bars. So the longer it is, the more species have their mean flowering time in that segment of the year. And so from these two patterns, what we can see is that the specialist bird-pollinated species flower, well, there's some species that flower in the winter period, but they mostly flower in spring and summer. And that's shown by, well, you can see it around the circle, and there's the resultant really points to November as the peak flowering time for the specialist bird-pollinated species. And then the generalist bird-pollinated species, again, they also have a peak, but just a strong peak in September, and then a lot more flowering, much more evenly around the year. So both groups of pollination, different pollination classes, have flowering throughout the year, but you can really see in the generalist bird-pollinated species that they are more distributed to be in the end of winter, so August, whereas in the specialist bird-pollinated species, it's more in early summer, late spring. So they did another analysis, which was looking at the temporal temporal abundance of flowers, rather. So each dot here, they're all piled up on top of each other, so you can't see them very well, but each dot represents an individual flowering record. And this gives a much better understanding of the ecological situation that's happening with these different flowering times. So with the specialist bird-pollinated species, you can really see that there are resources available throughout the year. These are all different species that are distributed around the year to have a pretty constant supply of nectar around the year. Whereas in the generalist bird-pollinated species, you can see that there's a much stronger peak in this portion of the year, which is the late winter spring period. Okay, so we can see there are significant differences in the patterns of flowering phenology between the generalist bird-pollinated species and the specialist bird-pollinated species. And this provides further support for generalist bird pollination and specialist bird pollination being recognized as two distinct classes of ornithopony. So that's bird pollination. So flowering phenology can be a defining characteristic of a pollination syndrome. And the explanation that I give for why there might be a separation in these patterns of flowering phenology between these two classes, I think it's based on the resource availability. So with specialist birds requiring a much more constant nectar supply for their dietary requirements, so needing a food supply throughout the year, whereas generalist birds are much more opportunistic in their nectar feeding, and therefore to make use of them as efficient pollinators, it's best to flower in winter or late winter, early spring, when other resources are not abundant, and therefore you're much more likely to get a reliable pollinator because the birds will be feeding on nectar a lot more frequently during that time period. There are, of course, other phenomena that also impact flowering phenology. So these cannot be ignored, and there are things such as seed predation avoidance, the timing of seed maturation, herbivory, phylogenetic constraints within taxa, and the climate. So these are all other factors that are also playing on when plants flower. It's not, you can't just be specialized to your pollinator. There are other factors that will also be acting as natural selection factors on flowering phenology. And so this is looking at the phylogenetic constraints. So there are some species that, or genera rather, that definitely do tend to flower at particular times of the year, but this is not always the case. So this is Aloe, which this large genus of succulent plants, and you can see that the patterns in Aloe follow the general patterns overall. So in specialist bird-pollinated species, the species are distributed throughout the year, whereas in generalist bird-pollinated species, these Aloe species mostly flower in winter and early spring. This pattern is also seen in Erythrina, the coral trees. So you have these in the specialist bird-pollinated species, they are distributed, well, not throughout the year, but quite widely, whereas in the generalist bird-pollinated species, they really only were flowering in late winter, early spring. Something interesting to note here with Erythrina is that as you go around the year with their different flowering times, so Humiana, then Latissima, Capra, then Lysostemon, so these are the two generalist bird-pollinated species, the Capra and the Latissima, whereas the others are all specialist bird-pollinated. And it is interesting to note that the morphology of the flowers also seems to go through a kind of spectrum with being very specialized, these tubes, slightly wider, then really quite wide in these two species, and then a bit tighter again, and then a tighter tube again in Erythrina zyri. So the pattern of specialization also shown in the morphology. So potentially these ones, Latissima and, well, particularly Latissima, which also is more in early spring, it may be partly have some visitors, so some visitors of generalist birds that would select against it being as specialized as the other more extreme summer flowering species. So climate is also a very important factor that can affect flowering phenology, as I said. And regions with extreme seasonality are much more likely to have distinct peaks in flowering. And this is because plants, they have these limitations. So if there isn't rain and if the resources they need for flowering are not available, then they just can't flower or be adapted to flower at a time when their pollinators or potential pollinators would be most active. And so climate is definitely a limiting factor of how much adaptation there can be to flowering phenology as an adaptation to particular pollinators. And I was looking at the summer rainfall region, and so most of these flowers, the rainfall they're experiencing will be starting in summer, so winter will be a fairly dry period for them. And then bird migrations are also an important factor that's also impacted by the climate, which therefore will also be linking to the whether or not they can be used as pollinators. And a very interesting example I found here was, if you look at Nephofia, these are the Redhot pokers, you can see that all the species, except for one, flower in summer, regardless of whether or not they're pollinated by generalist or specialist birds. And then we have this one exception, Nephofia ruperi. And when we look at the generalist bird pollinated species a bit closer, we see that the ones that flower in summer, when you wouldn't really expect them to be generalist bird pollinated because there's going to be lots of resources around, so the birds won't be very specific on them. But when you look at the distributions of these two species, you can see that they are at high altitudes, whereas Nephofia ruperi is at low altitudes. And so what's interesting here is that during winter, the birds will migrate down to the coastal regions where it's warmer. And so Nephofia ruperi will be pollinated during that time. But if these two species at the high altitudes also flower during winter, the pollinators aren't going to be around at those high altitudes during that time. So to be flowering when their pollinators are available, they have to flower in summer because the pollinators are not going to be active in these areas during winter. So where you are geographically is also an important factor that plants, the adaptation has to take into account for selecting particular pollinators. Then climate change. This is also always an important topic now to consider. And climate change can result in disruptions to the temporal positioning of plants flowering. And if this happens, it could result in gaps forming in the sequence of species that are pollinated by specialist birds, particularly. So if specialist bird pollinated species are not flowering throughout the year due to there being perhaps particularly dry periods in winter or in autumn or something like that, then it could result in a breakage in this continuous chain of specialist bird pollinated species. And that could have severe consequences on birds that are very reliant on nectar as resources. So in conclusion, patterns of flowering phenology were found to differ between generalist bird pollinated species and specialist bird pollinated species. And there were definite patterns that do seem to be linked to these pollinators. But the future research to further look into this needs to be looked at the pollinators themselves and what their behavior is and migrations, to consider altitude in as a factor in flowering phenology and latitude as well, because seasons also shift differently at different times of the year. Well, the seasons comes at different times at different latitudes. So you might have an earlier spring or a later spring, depending on your latitude. And then also the temporal changes in bird abundances throughout the year. So thank you very much. I also want to have a special thank you to my supervisor, Prof. Craig Peter from Rhodes University, who was a very important person in this project, really guiding me through it and helped me school plants for flowering and just providing general guidance throughout my project. Sanby for providing data from the Botanical Database of Southern Africa. All the many citizen scientists who contributed their observations through iNaturalist and the Virtual Museums projects. These were such important resources, so really a big thank you to all the people who contributed to iNaturalist particularly. It's really a wonderful platform for scientists and citizens to contribute to data together, and then wonderful research can also come out of that. So that's really fantastic. I also want to thank the many people who provided photos and evidence of pollinators, and particularly for photos from Lynette Rudman, who really gave me some lovely photos of birds. So many of these photos to this presentation have either been from Lynette or from Craig. And so thank you very much for those. And I also want to thank my funders. And of course, thank you to Learn the Birds for inviting me to give this presentation. And of course, to everyone who came this evening, thank you very much for listening. And if there are any questions, you're welcome to ask. And you're also welcome to contact me. This is my email address, lauren.jms1@gmail.com. So you're also welcome to send me queries about my research on that. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Lauren. That was very, very interesting. I'm sure we all learned a lot from that. We've got the first question from John. He said, is there an association between flowering periods of the plants and breeding seasons of specialist and generalist birds?
That's an interesting question. And I'm afraid it's one I can't answer because I don't know the breeding periods of different birds. I really haven't looked into that at all. But that would be interesting to think about the resources that birds would require if they are busy feeding chicks or not. So that would be an interesting thing to consider. But I do imagine that most of them breed probably in spring, and that would be my gut feeling. And just spring is the time of reproduction for many organisms. So that is also why there's a greater peak in both generalist bird-pollinated plants and specialist bird pollinators in springs, because that is a time when resources are just available. It's the end of winter. So there are many other factors other than pollination that are, well, everything that makes everything reproduce in spring. Yeah, those climatic factors.
Thanks. And Faraz asks, do the generalists only flower at specific times because of the competition with other flowering plants?
Well, the idea is that the generalist bird-pollinated plants flower in mostly late winter and early spring, because this is the time when there are few resources available for the birds. So if you are going to be pollinated by a generalist bird, which is really a very opportunistic nectar feeder, these birds feed on so many other things. And so really to make most use of them as a pollinator, you want to get them when they are hungry. And they're going to be hungry in late winter when other resources are not available. And so you're most likely to have a bird of that group visiting during winter, well, winter to beginning of spring. And so that's why the generalist bird-pollinated plants are mostly flowering in that time period, because if they flowered at other times of the year, these very generalist birds will be feeding on all kinds of other things as well, and really not focused on the nectar, and the pollen will be wasted and taken off to other places rather than reliably being taken to another plant of the same species. And that's why it's thought that flowering in this time when resources for birds is limited would be selecting for pollination from this particular group of pollinators at that time. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. And then Nikki asks, with the Nephofia species at high altitudes, possibly colder winter conditions would also be a limiting factor with flowering.
Yes, definitely. That would definitely be a factor as well. So not only are the pollinators not there, but the climatic conditions are not conducive to flowering during winter as well. Yes, definitely.
And then Christine says, great to see the data and images from our naturalists being used for research projects like this. But the data is very valuable.
It was a really fantastic resource. And as I said at the beginning of my talk, most of my data collection I actually did during the COVID lockdown. So it was a matter of going through iNaturalist and scoring plants for their flowering. And that really gave me this amazing data set that I wouldn't have been able to collect in person anyway. So it's really been a wonderful resource.
Yeah. Just to add something, I've always found like some of these generalist birds, like say the Cape weavers, they eat mainly
Yes.
seeds, but in winter when seeds are maybe scarce, you know, that energy from the nectar keeps them going, I think, as well, like on really cold days. Was they swarm, they like go to the aloes and, you know, they go crazy about that aloe nectar.
Yes, definitely. And interestingly, there've been a few studies on the nectar properties of specialist compared to generalist bird-pollinated species. And there seem to be different sugars dominated in the nectar of these two different groups. So that's another trait that's separating these two classes of bird pollination, that different nectar properties, different floral structures, and now, as I've seen, different flowering phenology as well.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah. And then Nikki adds, just to follow up, our naturalist, are identifications generally quite accurate?
It does depend. I did check every single record, or between myself and Craig, we checked every single record we used for flowering, because we had to look at it and see whether or not there was a flower in the photo or not and score that. So it varies. It does vary. There are some groups that are quite hard to identify, and so for those we had to do quite a lot of checking up to check that they were right. But in general, people are actually pretty good at getting the right identifications. And if not, sometimes it's just left at genus level rather than going to a specific species.
Cool. And Phil asks, are there any South African plants that are only pollinated by birds, or are most species pollinated by other organisms as well?
Well, most of these species that I've been talking about, well, that I did my research on, well, the specialist ones, well, actually all of these species, they will all predominantly be pollinated by birds. And that's why they have got these traits that they've kind of all collectively evolved to have, because these are traits that work for being pollinated by birds. So birds are the main pollinators for this 143 species that I identified that all have these similar traits. There will be some cases where other organisms do actually effectively pollinate a particular species, but those will be much rarer compared to the bird pollination events. So these species I'm talking about really are predominantly pollinated by birds.
Thanks. Jody asks, do you see the flowering seasons and patterns shifting significantly in the future due to climate change? And would this maybe create some type of evolution in the bird and flower feeding and blooming patterns?
Well, if the climate changes to have more extreme conditions, so perhaps a much drier winter and a much wetter summer, or just and having that period of like rainfall in summer, for example, in a much smaller intense period, then that will definitely limit the growth of plants and when they can flower due to resource availability. And that will definitely impact the birds. So if your flowering is, particularly thinking of the specialist bird-pollinated species, if the flowering changes to really be concentrated around that period, and species that do not manage to flower in a time close enough to the rainfall period, those species will be selected against, and they will disappear. And the ones that are, and even within the species, individuals as well that are flowering at the time when conditions are conducive to flowering will be the ones that survive. And so it can definitely lead to a narrowing of the flowering period. And that would mean that there are times during the year, at least in the specialist pollinated species, when there are not resources available potentially. And that definitely could impact the specialist bird group.
Thanks. Are there any more questions? It looks like everybody's asked everything. Lauren, thanks so much. I think we learned so much from that talk. It was really great having you, and thanks for everyone that attended. The people are saying how they're enjoying it. We hope to see you all next month at our last 2022 webinar for the year. Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you very much, Lynette, for inviting me to give this talk as well.
It's a great pleasure.